Your
Yes,
Honor,
Your Honor. Plaintiff's call Alan Wolk.
and we have a motion regarding Mr.
Hang on a second, Ms. Dickey. I didn't hear what Ms. Burgess said. Can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, yes, plaintiff's call Alan Wolk.
Okay, Ms. Dickey?
We have a motion regarding Alan Walk.
All right. Is that one of the things that we need to take up in the closed courtroom or not?
No, I don't think we need to take this up in the closed courtroom.
All right, then what's your motion?
Your Honor, at the beginning of trial, which was actually 2 weeks ago today, we heard some argument on our motion to exclude testimony of improperly designated witnesses. One of those was Mr. Wolk. And at the time we made brief argument on that, and you said, okay, we're going to wait and to see if they actually call him. And so I'd like to make a brief argument on that.
Okay.
Your Honor, in this case, we've heard from counsel for Flo that there's no scheduling order, which actually is true. But under the Texas rule, we have no scheduling order, then we, as you know, default to level 2 under Rule 190.3. So that means that he had to be designated 30 days in advance of trial. He was actually designated right on that mark by Ms. Burgess and Flow Sports Council, so they knew that, and they designated him in a way that we consider to be deficient. Basically, they say he reviewed the website, he reviewed the injunction hearings, he reviewed testimony, and it's his opinion, and he has determined that they are competitors. On October 19th, in response to that designation, Your Honor, we filed the motion that is now before the court, and got no supplementation at that time. On October 27th, 8 days before trial, they supplemented, not with any further description other than the essential one paragraph that they had given us, but with a list of documents that he'd reviewed, which, as I said, involved some tweets, injunction hearing transcripts, transcripts of depositions, and really nothing further. Now they, as part of our exchange process, they are seeking to introduce some exhibits and evidence through him that was not even on the list of things that he reviewed on what was provided to us on October 27th, 8 days before trial. And we'll have an objection to those if they go forward, that they're not appropriately admitted through him. We believe not only is his designation untimely and insufficient, we believe that his opinions on competition are just based on some part of what you've heard. You, in this case, Your Honor, I toted up, there have been 10 hearings in this case prior to trial, 6 of which you heard. And we've now, this is actually our 7th, at least partial day of being before this court. So our second basis, Your Honor, is that where a fact finder such as yourself, where we don't have a jury, is equally competent to form an opinion on the ultimate fact issues, we do not believe Mr. Wolk coming in, having read bits and pieces of things when you have heard all the evidence, is really adding anything of benefit to this record. It's entirely cumulative, and it's him reviewing some of the evidence which you have listened to over a longer period of time, which is, as I understand it, the Kmart versus Honeycutt case. Your Honor, I thought that I would go ahead because I believe their next witness is Aubrey Davis, and he is also part of this motion. I think the court ruled as to the fact witnesses that they are just to be fact witnesses and not to be expert witnesses. But if we have any issue on that, I just wanted to make sure we set that. Your Honor, we're in the situation now where we desperately want to finish tomorrow. We wanted to finish last week, but we desperately want to finish tomorrow. And I think this is their last liability witness. Miss Burgess represented to the court on Thursday afternoon that she had 4 hours, 2 of which she consumed on Friday. She's now told us she was just flat wrong, but she did not correct that with the court on Friday when she had the opportunity. We want to get to it. We want to get the damages.
Let's stay focused for the moment on Mr. Wolk, because that we can deal with and figure it out.
Okay, so, well,
tell me more, if any, on your objection to, or your motion to, I take it it's in the nature of a motion to strike the testimony of Mr. Wolk for the reasons you've articulated, and any others, if there are any others.
No, it's really just the two things, Your Honor: inadequate disclosure, inadequate description, and then in addition that he adds nothing to that you can't arrive at yourself. You're not an unsophisticated jury. You're a very sophisticated juror, and you have heard more of this than Mr. Wolk. And his disclosure basically says he's going to come in here and tell you that he's read all this stuff and they're competitors.
Okay, Ms. Burgess, what's your response?
Sure. Regardless, we're going to get out of here by tomorrow. Based on our conference yesterday, this is not going to take up too much time. But this isn't a gatekeeping role. With a bench trial, there is no gatekeeper. As Ms. Dickey said, he's testifying to fact issues, not legal issues. No one has studied direct-to-consumer media probably more than Mr. Wolk. He has a book on it that's used as a textbook. We are frankly very surprised, and we were surprised, a month before trial, that competition was even still an issue in the case, particularly once they started airing live wrestling events that we were competing for. But when it was still an issue in the case, we got the guy to talk about the competitive analysis here. And he's here, he's ready. It'll take less than an hour from our perspective. And we would ask that you would allow us to put on Mr. Wolk.
So I need some clarification, because I know with regard to some witnesses who we talked about that were just going to be fact witnesses, I'm not, and Ms. Dickey mentioned Aubrey Davis, but I guess I need to be reminded whether or not the designation of Mr. Wolk is as an expert, and if so, what is his expertise?
Yes, he is only designated as an expert. He's not a fact witness. We
Okay.
understand the court's ruling on Aubrey Davis, and that's how we've proceeded with the other witnesses.
Okay.
It hasn't
So,
changed what they're going to say.
Great. Now that we've cleared that up, what is Mr. Wolk's expertise?
He is trying to pull out his our actual disclosure. He's an expert on competitive analysis. He wrote a book called Over the Top about direct-to-consumer media. He actually has served on a panel with Mr. Floriani at a sports media conference in the past. He is an expert on competition in direct-to-consumer media.
What does that mean? What is it? What kind of what is a comparative analysis? What does that mean to be an expert on competition? I don't understand what that means. Is he going to tell me that Coke and Pepsi are competitors in the business? We already know that, right? So what does that mean to be to provide a competitive analysis?
Well, he has reviewed both party sites deeply, something that hasn't been before the court. He has reviewed documents from both sides. He's reviewed.
Oh, I'm not asking about the work that he's done in this case. I'm asking objectively, what kind of expert is a competitive analysis expert? That's my question. I mean, if you tell me that we have a case involving medical malpractice and that, there's a heart issue, I expect cardiologists to come and talk to me about that, because I recognize that cardiologists are experts in heart doctor stuff. My question is, what kind of expert is there in competitive analysis? What does that mean? What kind of school do you go to? What kind of certification do you get? What kind of peer-reviewed articles are there? And what kind of expertise does one have to be such an expert? That's my question. I'm asking.
That's certainly something that he's going to talk about. He's written a book on it that's used as a textbook at business schools and otherwise. He on over the top media, which means over the top of the cable box. And he has he lectured at USC last year. This is the kind of experiential expert.
You're answering a different question than the one I'm trying to ask, and that's probably because I've asked it poorly. I'm not asking what he did in this case. I'm not asking about what his thoughts are generally in the world. I'm just trying to understand, objectively speaking, what kind of an expert. If I go home tonight and tell my husband I heard from an expert, how will I describe it? I will say I heard an expert in competition. I will say I heard an expert. What does that mean? What is an expert? Objectively speaking, what kind of an expert is an expert in competitive analysis of sports media? That's the piece I'm trying to objectively get to. I appreciate he's got a lot of experience. I appreciate he's done a deep dive in this area. I appreciate that he's done some work on this case. What I'm asking you to step back and sort of get the big picture about is, as a genre, if you will, what kind of expert am I going to hear from in this case?
Media, in particular, or over the top media. So beyond the cable box media. And actually, he'll tell you that this is something he couldn't have gone to school for, or we couldn't have gone to school for, because it wasn't invented when we went to school. So it's something that he has developed over time and actually teaches the students about.
So he's a media expert.
Yes.
With some particular knowledge and experience related to media company competition?
He does competitive analysis for media companies and companies that are offering these types of offerings over the internet.
Okay, so tell me more about that. Why does somebody hire such an expert, and what do they do with the information he tells them?
Judge, I feel like he would be better to tell this, and since it's goes to the weight of the evidence and you're the judge of the evidence, it seems like the best way would be to put him on and the other side can voir dire him, so that you can see his background.
That means you cannot answer my question? I mean, I'm okay with that if you can, but if you can, I'm just looking right now for a little bit of sort of context. So what does one do when one hires a competitive analysis in the media market? What does one do with that information?
I would assume you craft your business model around it, or you tweak your business model, or you get better at what you do so that you can compete better.
So, okay, all right. Well, I'm frankly at a loss to understand whether or not this is in the nature of information that would be helpful to the fact finder, me in this case, and whether or not it is something that I need expertise to determine. I'm not so sure I do with regard to what the non-compete requires and allows and doesn't allow and prohibits. I'm not really sure I do, but I confess no expertise of my own in the area of media and media company work. So I'll overrule the objection. I don't know what weight I'll give the testimony, but I'll allow it so that we can hear what he has to say in case there's something about competition that isn't something I can just determine as a lay jurist. But I'll hear it. I'll overrule the objection. Again, I don't know what weight it'll be given, but let's get through it quickly. Mr. Wolk, if you raise your right hand, I'll swear you in, please, and unmute. There you go. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
State your name and spell your last name for us, please.
Sure. My name is Alan Wolk, AlanWolk.
Thank you. Ms. Burgess, you may proceed.
And Your Honor, may I, since Ms. Burgess mentioned it, I would like to take him up on voir dire before he gets started, if I may.
No, I've ruled on the motion to exclude him as a witness, so no. But when he is asked a question that you think and you object to it because you don't think he has sufficient qualifications or whatever, you can tell me about it then. I don't have enough context about what he's going to offer as an expert, frankly, to be able to decide. Yeah, it's more efficient if we just hear from him. If you have an objection, we'll take it up at that time. Go ahead.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Walton?
I am the co-founder and lead analyst at a company called TV Rev. We are a media analyst firm. We work with a number.
Have you ever been? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I say we work with a range of media companies, from big brands like Hulu and Warner Media to startups to packaged goods companies, like Procter & Gamble. And as you were implying previously, we provide them with analysis of what's going on in the industry, who their competition is, what they're up to, et cetera.
And have you ever been involved in litigation before?
I have not.
Have you ever testified as an expert?
I have not.
Do you conduct competitive analyses in your day-to-day work?
Yes, I do.
And did you do something similar here?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about your expertise and how you got it.
Okay, about 10 years ago, I was working for a company called Pixel. They were building out websites for streaming media companies. They were building out the actual apps for streaming media at around the same time that it was becoming a very big thing where a lot of companies were sort of getting involved in it and interested in it. I was the head of strategy, so I had some interest in it. Started doing a lot of writing and speaking about it. Since we were building out the sites, we were among the few people who actually knew what was going on. I also ran something called the Second Screen Society, which sort of was about helping the second screen apps, or apps that are on the phone that you use concurrently.
Tell us what a second screen is.
And Mr. Wolf, let me just remind you that we have a very hardworking court reporter taking all of this down. It's very difficult for her to do so when we speed through phrases and words that might not be as familiar for those not in the industry, and your literal speed is such that I'm concerned that it's going to be hard for her to take it down. So I'm going to ask you to slow down a little bit.
Okay, I apologize. I'm a native New Yorker, so sorry.
Yeah.
I will slow down.
I grant that you might be an expert in regional dialect, but what I need you to do right now is slow down, speak up, and I can't have you and Ms. Burgess talking at the same time. So if she starts to interrupt to ask a question or to clarify something, if you could stop your testimony until she's had a chance to do that, that would be helpful. She'll try not to do that very much because that's exactly not what she's supposed to be doing, but she might need to do that from time to time. And if so, let her get her clarification out so that we don't waste a lot of time. With that, Ms. Burgess, you can ask him your question.
Yes, what is the second screen?
The second screen is when you use a phone or a tablet at the same time that you're watching a television show or something on the bigger screen, so that you actually have two screens going and they sort of interact with each other. And
did you win an award about that from Wired Magazine?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I was named one of the 10 top people in second screen, gosh, in about 2011 or 2012, I believe.
Okay, and so you were telling us about how you became an expert in, would you say an expert in digital media?
Yes, in all video related media. So as I was saying, I started to do a lot of writing and speaking, and then in 2015, I wrote a book. The book was called Over the Top: How the Internet is Slowly but Surely Changing the Television Industry. The book was reviewed as a cover story in the New York Review of Books, which is a sort of a big deal. And it got a lot of press as a result. And because of that, I decided to start my own company and went out on my own and worked with a number of firms as the industry progressed into where it is today. We work with everybody, like I said, from big streaming services to startups, and we provide them with analysis, with reports on where the industry is going, who their competition might be, what we think the correct next steps for them are, and what the marketplace looks like, where how they should be best investing their money.
Do you lecture at any universities or business schools?
Yes, I have. I have lectured at a number of schools, most recently University of Southern California Business School and Penn State.
Have you met Mr. Floriani before?
Yes, I have actually. Funny. I was the moderator of a panel at a sports video conference that Mr. Floriani was speaking at about 4 or 5 years ago. And that's where we met.
The court asked a question that I'd like you to answer, which is, what do these businesses do with the analysis that you conduct?
You guys were sort of spot on with that. They take it and they use it to frame their market strategy, whether that's the type of content that they're going after, the type of audiences that they're going after, what new features they might introduce. So they basically use it also, if they're a smaller company, to help raise money.
Now, what were you asked to do in this case?
I was asked to provide an opinion as to whether I thought that Flow Sports and Rockfit were competitive with each other in the sports video space.
And what did you find?
I found that they were. I found that that the market that they were going after specifically the collegiate wrestling audience was a fairly small audience, that they provided similar content that would appeal to the same audience. They were also looking at the same group of journalists and experts and the same group of content providers, so that they were we always look at, let me step back. One of our stocks and trade at TV Rivers, we look at everything from a consumer point of view. How does the consumer look at this? Because too often, sorry.
You started speeding back up again. So so you're telling us about your point of view.
Yes. So we look at everything from a consumer point of view. How does the consumer perceive your product versus how you positioned it in your mind as the founder or the owner of the company? And in this instance, who is the audience for this? It's likely somebody who is either currently a collegiate wrestler or formerly a collegiate wrestler, or most likely someone who is in high school and is looking to wrestle in college and is very interested in following this. And the type of content that both provide, which is around rankings and analysis and insights into coaches, plus the occasional, the videos that they have in the live matches, would appeal to the same audience. So in that case, if I was looking for that type of content, those would be the two of the places that I would go.
Now, did you talk to any people to help prepare your testimony or your analysis?
Yes. I spoke with Phil Wendler from Flow Sports a bit. Spoke with you, with Paul, but mostly I did my own research. I like it's better for me to sort of go in and sort of get a sense of what everything looks like from my own POV.
And when you say POV?
Point of view, yes.
And actually, while we're doing alphabet soup, can you define OTT?
Yes. OTT means over the top. The legend is that the original boxes actually went over the top of the television set, and that's why they called it that. But it basically refers to any sort of video that is delivered over the internet versus delivered via satellite or cable.
And when we say DTC, what does that mean?
DTC means direct to consumer. It means that you don't have a third party, you don't have a Comcast or a Verizon sort of as your intermediary.
Did you review any testimony in this case?
I'm sorry?
Did you review any testimony in this case?
Yes, I did. I watched the testimony of Martin Floriani on, I believe it was Friday, and I also reviewed some of the earlier testimony.
What are the categories of documents that you reviewed?
I had looked at some, PDFs of Facebook ads, of tweets. I listened to a podcast with Kale, the coach of the Nittany Lions, and I looked at some of the transcripts from the trial.
Did you also go through both websites?
Yes, of course, yes. I looked at both websites, joined, and all that.
Are both of these companies in providing products and services in the sports video industry?
Objection, leading.
And objection to relevance.
I'm still having trouble with my space bar here. Sorry. The objection is sustained as to the leading.
Okay. What business are these companies in?
They are both in the online video industry in business, and they also both have sports video content on them. So they're both in the sports video industry.
And have you reached a conclusion about whether they compete with each other?
Yes, I had said that before. They do indeed compete with each other.
What about Mat Scouts at the channel level? Does that also compete with Flow Sports?
Objection, leading and vague.
Sustained as to the leading.
What is Mat Scouts, Mr. Walt?
Mat Scouts is a channel within Rockfin. it is, from the testimony, I was able to learn what the business arrangement is. But as I was saying before, if I am a consumer, it just comes off as another group of sort of a set of content under the wrestling umbrella on Rockfin. And it certainly, it has a lot of overlap with what is available on Flow Sports.
What were you able to tell what percentage of content on Rockfin was wrestling?
I didn't do a strict numerical analysis, but it seemed that a goodly percentage of it was. There was political, basically the content seemed to consist of political commentaries and
Speculation Foundation.
I'm sorry, Mr. Brudical, you were kind of, I couldn't hear you the other day and that one was so loud, I couldn't hear. Past the yelling.
I turned it up for you. I got to turn it down now.
No, I want you to leave it up, but not too loud. Tell me, I'm sorry, what was your objection?
Objection calls for speculation, lack of foundation.
It's not clear, Ms. Burgess, whether or not Mr. Walk is provided any basis for how he would know that information. So I'll sustain the objection.
Mr. Walk, did you find, how much wrestling content did you find on the site?
When I looked at the Rockfin site, there was a large amount of wrestling content. It seemed to be a goodly percentage of the content that was available on the website was around wrestling.
Same objection, Your Honor. Foundation, move to strike.
Well, the motion to strike is denied. Just let's clarify, the information that he's asked and is providing is just what he observed when he went to the site. Is that right, Mr. Walk?
That is correct, Judge.
So he's only telling us about his experience. The objections are overruled. Go ahead, Ms.
Yes,
Burgess.
Mr. Walk, what, in your opinion, are Rockfin and Mat Scouts competing with Flow Sports for?
Rockfin and Mat Scouts are competing with Flow Sports for two things. They're competing for audience, because the audience of people who are interested in collegiate wrestling at that level, where there's community around it, where there's a community site around it and discussing it and rankings and everything, is fairly limited. So they're competing for those people. They're also quite dedicated to, and they're also competing for content. There's two levels to the content. There's the people who are actually creating it, the sort of journalists and scouts and people like that. And then there's the actual events themselves, the live events that they would eventually be competing for too, which there are a limited number of.
Now, Mr. Weisrott, could you put up 255? And have you seen this before, Mr. Walt?
I have indeed.
And from a consumer point of view, what is the process here?
Objection vague.
Sustained. I don't know what that means.
How would a consumer purchase the rights to exclusively see this event?
Objection foundation, lack speculation.
Sustained.
Mr. Walk, are you aware if consumers could see this event without purchasing Rockfin?
Objection foundation.
Sustained.
You can take that down. And I move for admission of F126, which is Mr. Walk's CV. I don't know if, is that agreed? Okay. I don't know if there are any objections to that.
126, is that what you said?
F126.
No objection is CB.
No objection, Your Honor.
I don't have 126 on my list. I have
It was
125 and 127. I do not have a 126. But if you all have it, if you have it in the box and that's numbered correctly and there's no objection, I'm happy to admit it. What is it?
It's his CV.
Okay, there's no objection to it, so it'll be admitted as 126. Just make sure it's uploaded with that exhibit sticker on the first page, because it's not on my list. Okay.
Mr. Walk, do you recall hearing Mr. Floriani testify about why he thought that Rockfin was different than Flow Sports?
I did.
Okay, and what differences did he call out?
Objection, foundation relevance, Your Honor.
Well, I'm gonna not allow it because it's repetitious. We all heard his testimony at length. Let's move on.
Okay. With regard to the fact that Rockfin is a technology platform or content neutral, how does that impact the analysis that you've done?
From a, from a bottom, if I was an investor, it would impact how I looked at it versus other things. But from a consumer or content provider POV, it didn't really seem that important. That I don't know. I didn't get the sense that a consumer would be in any way aware of how any of that worked. That they would just be aware of the fact that, okay, if I want to watch Nittany Lions wrestling, or if
Your
I
Honor,
want,
I'm going to object to this speculation and lack of foundation as to what consumers think.
Well, the question was the fact that Rofkin is a technology platform or content neutral. How does that impact the analysis? So I think he's answering a question about analysis, or at least that's what he was asked to do. And so I can't tell, though, Mr. Wolk, what you're now saying about if you wanted to watch wrestling plays into an analysis. So perhaps we could focus your answer just on what analysis you conducted and not put yourself necessarily in the place of someone who might consume this information. What's the analysis? Can you tell me that I can't figure out myself from listening to what these folks testified to that will help me make a decision about this? So tell me about the analysis.
so from the analysis point of view, that from a consumer facing standpoint, the differences in the technology are not visible to the consumer, that all they see is this is a place to watch the video, and they're not informed of how the business operations work. They pay their $9.99 a month, and then they have access to various videos and other content.
Your Honor, I'm going to object at this point that this testimony is not expert testimony. This is nothing that the court could not determine itself.
Well, he's already provided that answer, and so I'm going to move on. I appreciate that you all have a motion to strike. To the extent that you want to urge an objection to any specific question, you may do so, but I'm going to let him testify. I may give it absolutely no weight, but he can tell me what he does in this industry, and I would like to hear about it. Go ahead.
Mr. Wolk, what about the fact that Rockfin claims to have solved what they call the creator's dilemma by using blockchain technology? How does that impact the analysis you conduct?
Again, it may impact how they pay, what their relationships are with various content owners. But again, the fact that consumers don't know, that's not something a consumer would be aware of or particularly care about. What consumers care about is what content there is on there. We have seen in my business, blockchain was a very hot thing about a year ago. We saw a lot of companies that were sort of touting that, and then they quickly found out that nobody really cared. The sort of the behind the scenes payment methods throughout the industry are always very different, whether it's blockchain or anything else. The consumer is really concerned with where can they get it and how much will it cost them.
Have you seen a podcast where Rockfin discussed the impact on consumers or lack thereof?
I had heard the Kel Sanderson's where he talked podcast. Is that what you're referring to?
No, but that's okay. I can ask Rockfin that question. What about the fact that Rockfin doesn't own the content that it streams? How does that impact the analysis that you do?
Again, it matters how much for the content owner. It matters how much they're getting paid, and for the consumer, it matters what they can watch. Everything else is sort of behind the scenes.
Now, what about for consumers with these two options, Rockfin, Mat Scouts versus Flow Sports? Are those alternatives?
It depends. They can be complementary. They can be alternatives. It depends how much budget you have. and how much, and how much you want, how much wrestling content you want to engage, but you would clearly pick, one would be the priority and then another one would be your second choice.
And because can media companies be complementary and also be competitive?
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. All of the big media companies, like if you look at, say, Netflix and Hulu, I may, make Netflix my number one choice, but I may also subscribe to Hulu. And then if but for somebody whose budget is tight, they might only pick one of them.
Now, what about from a rights holder perspective or a content provider perspective? Are these alternatives?
Your Honor, objection, lack of foundation.
I don't understand the question, alternatives, meaning can a content provider choose one or the other?
Yes.
I think that's pretty obvious. So let's move on.
Gotcha. Let's see. Now, did you see any differences in these two platforms that caused you to believe that they were not competitive?
No, not really. I mean, the biggest difference seemed to be in the payment method. One was a yearly contract and one was a monthly.
Now, does Rockfin publish content?
Objection, vague.
Well, I don't know that it's vague. I don't know what information he might have about that. So I don't know what knowledge he would know about what they, and if he does, he hasn't established that he does about that. So let's get that cleared up first.
Mr. Walk, do you know whether Rockfin publishes content?
They host content on their site, publish, whether you would say they publish it or not, they certainly, it is hosted on their site. They host various channels like such as Matt Scouts on their site. You would have to sort of figure a legal definition of publish, but the layman's term would be yes. The layman's answer would be yes.
And did you have a chance to review the terms of service for Rockfin?
Yes.
And does Rockfin make money off of content?
Objection
Yes, they
leading.
do.
I'm sorry, I misheard. I didn't hear you.
Oh, objection leading.
Sustained.
Did you hear Mr. Floriani testify that Nittany Lions was competing with Flow Sports?
Yes. He felt that they were they were a
Once again, you've answered her question, whether you read that testimony or not, or heard it, but I'm going to stop you because we're short on time. And I just want you to answer the specific question she's asking you. What's your follow-up, Ms. Burgess, if any?
Yes. Have you listened to a podcast where Cale Sanderson talked about competition between Rockfin and Flow Sports?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And what did he say?
Okay.
No, necessary. That aside from the obvious hearsay, Ms. Burgess, which you know about, come on, what is it that he does that
An expert can rely on hearsay.
He can rely on it, but so far he hasn't given us an opinion that tells us that that's the basis of it. Is he going to tell me that he thinks they're competitive because he heard Cale Sanderson in a conversation? If so, I'd like to hear that. But if that's not his testimony, we need to move on. Right?
Mr. Walk, did Cale Sanderson's podcast interview impact your competitive analysis?
At some level, yes. He confirmed it.
Okay. And what is it that he said?
Objection.
Objection or hearsay.
Hearsay.
Sustained. Look, Ms. Burgess, here's what I don't appreciate about what's happening here. Here's what I don't understand. Mr. Sanderson said something that confirmed what I thought all along. And so I get to tell you what he said that's otherwise just plain old hearsay. That does not seem to form the basis of the expert opinion. And if it does, it seems to be less of an expert opinion than just a repeat of what Mr. Sanderson said. Let Mr. Sanderson come and tell me what he thinks if he is an expert. But Mr. Walt's expertise is what I'm listening for. And so far, telling me what Mr. Sanderson, who's a customer of Rockfin essentially, is not the way to get us there.
Thank you, Judge. I may need to offer that exhibit. Hold on just. I'll come back to that, but I understand that you'll overrule it, but I want to just get that offer made in just a moment. Now, what factors weighed on why you think these two companies are competitors?
The audiences that they were going after for both viewers and subscribers, and also for the audience that they were going after for content providers.
And did you look at the kinds of content they provided?
Yes.
And were you able to review the Facebook audiences that Rockfin was targeting?
Objection
Yes.
leading.
Sustained.
Did the Facebook audiences that Rockfin targeted impact the analysis that you conducted?
Yes, at some level, yes, it did. It helped to confirm.
Okay. Now, how does the niche nature of wrestling impact your opinion?
There's a small audience, and there's not that many people that are interested in this, so that when someone else is providing this sort of content, this is pretty new. So if I was, for a wrestling fan, to have two options is going to be a great thing for them. You also have something that you might call the network effect in there, where you have one of these two, with a small audience, if one site starts getting better, more subscribers.
Objection, Your Honor, non-responsive.
I'm going to overrule. You can finish your statement. Go ahead.
And thus better content, that sort of has almost a flywheel effect where they keep getting, they're able to steal audience away. It's why street services like Netflix report the number of subscribers they have, because if they want to convince a Quentin Tarantino to make his next TV series with them, they can say, we have so many more subscribers, you'll get more exposure. It's a similar sort of thing and then it sort of builds on itself. So especially true when you have a limited audience.
Did you see that play out with Willie Saylor going to Rockfin from Flow Sports?
Objection, Your Honor, Foundation.
Sustained.
I pass the witness.
Good afternoon, Mr. Walt.
Good afternoon, sir.
Prior to being designated as an expert in this matter and contacting Flow Sports, had you ever heard of Rockfin?
No, I had not.
Your expertise is in the television and media area, correct?
In all video area, so digital video and television, which is sort of kind of crossing and becoming the same thing.
Okay, and you have a website or an online publication called, is it called TVRev?
TVRev, it's also the name of our company.
Okay, company and publication. And it does not cover sports, right?
It does occasionally, yes. We actually have a number of articles about sports and sports media.
Right, but it doesn't cover like sports events, like covering what happened in a football game.
No, it's all analysis. It's not news.
Right. And you yourself, you're not an expert in wrestling, are you?
No.
Are you an expert in sports?
I know a lot about
sports media, like the actual sports themselves.
No, I'm not an expert in sports.
And how about not the coverage of politics, but what about politics themselves? Are you any members of a think tank or anything like that?
I am not a member of a think tank, no.
Would you consider yourself to be a political expert?
No, I would not.
Okay. Now, when it says that you reviewed, both websites, how deep did you go into these websites?
I spent a few hours with them looking at what was there. Again, it's sort of what we call a consumer journey, where you go in and you sort of say, okay, if I am the consumer and going in, what is my experience? How do I see it? What is the user experience? How logical are a lot of the commands and the menus? And what do I get once I get there? What sort of content am I seeing?
Okay, so once you saw that there was wrestling content on Rockfin, how much deeper did you go than that?
I clicked on a bunch of the videos and saw what the people had to say. I looked at the comments underneath. I looked at how much there was, because the different sort of channels, if you will, like Matt Scouts and the different channels had different amounts of content on them. So how much there was. Some of them had a lot more than others. So that was something else, and sort of compared that to where Flow Sports was at, how much was available on Flow Sports.
Do you know how many channel partners Rockfin has?
Not off the top of my head, but it seemed a couple dozen at least.
A couple dozen. Did you notice how many non-sports related content channels Rockfin had?
Again, I didn't count. It seemed to be probably about 60% of them.
60% of them were not sports related?
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Okay, but you didn't did you go and review each channel provider on Rockfin?
Not every single one, no.
Which ones do you review besides Mad Scouts?
I don't remember the names of them. There were a bunch of the other wrestling. I went into all of the rest, basically looked at all of the wrestling channels. There were probably about a dozen of them.
Okay. Now, is there any special training and qualifications or experience for reviewing websites that you have that the court does not have?
I've been doing it and getting paid for it for about 15 years.
So yes, you have special training qualifications and experience in analyzing websites that the court doesn't have?
Like I said, I've been getting paid for it, and and have been doing it on a basis. There's no it's not, as to use the judge's example, it's not like I went to school to become a cardiologist. There is no specific training in this. There's no degree that one gets in this.
Okay, so are you finished with your answer?
Yes.
Okay, now you are, I believe you mentioned this, you're familiar with the distinction between platform and publisher, aren't you?
That is correct.
Okay, and the difference between the two is that the platform, in the pure sense, provides a medium through which a publisher can distribute or publish its content, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. You ever heard of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act? You know what that is?
No.
Do you know what the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is?
Yes, I do.
Okay, that's designed to protect internet-based platforms to allow users to publish content on their platforms, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And Rockfin, I think you mentioned this, but Rockfin has a name for the people who are posting content on their platform. They call them content creators. Are you familiar with that concept of a content creator on a platform?
Very.
Right. That's not a unique model that Rockfin has, is it?
That is correct.
And Rockfin calls these content creators on sites channels, and the part of the platform that allows subscribers to access the content of a particular content creator is Rockfin. Is that fair?
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, you know what? That was a really bad question. I'm going to move on. Okay, so we mentioned how it's not a unique model. Free YouTube is kind of a similar model where free YouTube provides a platform and then content creators can create channels on YouTube, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you were analyzing the Rockfin website, did you see an actual channel that was called the Rockfin channel?
I did not.
Right, because Rockfin itself doesn't have a channel on Rockfin, does it?
I don't understand the question.
Well, we talked about channels and content creators, correct?
Yes.
Remember that? Okay. And there is no channel or content creator called Rockfin on the Rockfin website, is there?
That is correct.
Okay. And you're not aware of Rockfin, right? Bidding for rights to broadcast anything, are you? Rockfin itself?
I am not.
Right, and it's not Rockfin that if someone wanted to broadcast something on the Rockfin platform, it would be a content creator, wouldn't it?
I don't understand the question.
Okay, well, let's say somebody wanted to put a wrestling match or any kind of live event on a Rockfin platform. Okay, let's just assume that. You with me?
Yes.
Right. Now, they could either own the event themselves and broadcast it through the channel on Rockfin's platform without getting any rights, correct?
You're asking me if they could set up their own channel on Rockfin and broadcast it?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. And if I wanted to be more of like a wrestling or any type of event broadcaster where I want to broadcast somebody else's event, presumably I would have to get the rights to do that in order to broadcast that on my channel on Rockfin, right?
So you're asking me that if you were to set yourself up as a wrestling channel, you would be able to go to a third party, get their content, and then broadcast it on Rockfin.
Right.
Okay, yes.
And there's nothing stopping, other than their own decision, stopping Flow Sports from actually doing that, creating a channel on Rockfin and broadcasting through the Rockfin platform, right?
I'm not qualified to speak to that.
Okay.
I don't know what legal arrangements there may be, but if in the absence of any legal arrangement prohibiting that, it does not seem that there would be any problem.
Okay. And I assume you're familiar with other platforms like Rockfin, like, have you ever heard of Patreon?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Substack?
Yes.
Now, I want to go to the targeting of the audiences that you talked about. You said that they're both targeting the NCAA wrestling community. Is that what your testimony?
They seem to be, yes. There's a lot of the wrestling content on there, or the stuff that I've seen has to do with collegiate wrestling and high school. Yeah.
I'm sorry, you were finished.
High school as well. So.
Right. And you're familiar with Mat Scouts, are you not?
Yes.
Right. Is it your opinion that Mat Scouts is targeting the collegiate wrestling audience?
At some level, yes.
Okay, and that's what you think that they're both going after, I guess Flow Sports and Rockfin is your testimony is that they're both going after that audience. Is that right?
And anyone who might be interested in that area.
Right. Okay, now, first of all, obviously you're an ad man. Just because two companies are targeting a similar demographic doesn't mean that they're competitors, right?
I'm not an ad man.
You're not an ad man?
No.
Okay, so you don't have any expertise in advertising? I thought I saw advertising on.
I do understand advertising, but I don't. An ad man would imply that I owned an advertising agency or created advertising. So.
Okay, Mr. Walk, I apologize if you do not like the term ad man, but I'm looking at your resume and you list among your top skills is advertising.
Yes. We work. So just so you have a clarity. We work with a lot of media companies to help them understand how the advertising market works and how best to monetize using advertising.
Right. And do you know enough about advertising to say comfortably that just because two companies are targeting the same demographic does not make them competitors necessarily?
Yes, it would depend on the circumstances. In other words, that, Ford trucks and a chewing tobacco might both be targeting the same male audience, but they don't compete with each other.
Okay, thank you. And I was going to ask you some other ones, but tobacco and Ford trucks works just fine. Now, if an entity, but it is your testimony, I believe, and I'd ask you to confirm that if an entity is posting content online about sports or other competition that Flow Sports may cover, that entity is posting competitive content. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
Now, when it comes to competitive content, what about the degree of competition? Does the amount of competitive content on a site matter when determining whether two sites compete?
It really depends on, that would be what the audience thought, right? It's a lot of times it's semantics, what you mean by compete. In other words, if the same audience holds both sets of content in similar value, then yes, there's competition, or they would be interested in it for similar reasons, then yes, it's competitive, even though it's different. They're not going to have identical content on it, but if they're looking, for content that's around a specific topic, then yes, then things can be in the media industry. I'm not sure. I apologize. I don't want to massacre your last name. You have stuff that's both complementary and competitive. In other words, I can watch, if I'm interested in murder mysteries, there's a range of murder mysteries I might watch, but there's also probably, if I had to pick, if I was limited, there's one that I would pick before others. So it's a similar situation here.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there because I think you went a little bit beyond my question, but I appreciate you attempting to answer it. I was asking about the amount of content on a site as to whether that matters. And your testimony, I believe, is it depends on what the consumer thinks. Is that fair?
Exactly. And how much overall content there is on the topic. In other words, if there's only 8 shows and I have 2 of them, then I'm still competitive because it's a quarter of the content.
Right. And what if I had 100 different kinds of content and another site had one of those kinds of content? Was that still competitive?
Again, it would depend on how available it was and how much of each one. In other words, YouTube YouTube may have a lot of beauty bloggers on it, but if I have a specific beauty site, I'm still competing with those beauty bloggers on YouTube, even though there's thousands of them on YouTube.
So the question of the degree to which the content is kind of a core part of the business offering could matter whether it's competitive or not?
It would seem to be, yeah.
Okay. Now, when we talk about competitive content, in the internet, right? Internet-based content, we're talking about competition for eyeballs, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, you're talking about, it depends. You could be talking about competition for eyeballs, but in this case, you seem to be talking about competition for subscription dollars, which is a big difference, right?
Well, okay, all right. Well, how about this? What if Rockfin were free? Would they be competing with Flow Sports in your mind?
That I'd have to think about that. I think they would be, but it would be a different model because they're not competing for the same dollars. I would be able to watch both, and then it would be a time limitation. So they would be competing less if they were free.
It would. So your testimony is that it doesn't matter, or it doesn't matter if it's
It
free?
It does matter if they were free or not.
And if they're free, then you're saying it would be I don't understand. What would the difference be for competition?
That I would be able to watch the free content without actually having to pay for it. So it'd be less of a barrier for entry for both. So it wouldn't be, they would be competing for audience, but not for subscription dollars. So it'd be a slightly lesser degree.
It'd be a lesser degree of competition.
It would be one less thing they would be competing for. They'd be competing for content providers, and they'd be competing for eyeballs, but they would not be competing for subscription dollars.
Right. And what about threat level to a company's business? Does that get into the question of whether 2 companies are a competitor? If somebody might provide similar content but is not a competitive threat to the other company, are they still competitors?
I'm not sure how you're defining competitive threat.
Well, let's just assume that we could assume that one company does not view another company as a competitive threat. Would that make a difference in your mind as to whether they're competitors?
Absolutely not. It's actually one of the reasons companies hire us, because they often view the wrong people as competitors. This is throughout the digital industry. And we look at what who their audiences think are actually competitive with them, who their audiences are using, and who their audiences are viewing, and what they think of as it being in the competitive set.
Does it matter in the Flow Sports Rockfin case? Does it matter whether you can broadcast live events on Rockfin or not? Like, let's assume that Rockfin's platform did not allow its channel partners to actually broadcast things. In your mind, would they still be competitors?
They'd be competitive. They would not be. Again, it's a matter of degree. They would not be competitors around the broadcasting of live content, but they would be competitors around community and sort of what traditionally would have been print, but sort of articles and everything else, other content around wrestling.
What if Rockfin was a newspaper and their channel partners just wrote articles and did rankings and took pictures of things? Would that be competitive with Flow Sports in your mind?
It would depend what sort of content was on there and how similar it was to what was on Flow Sports.
Okay. What about YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter? Are those competitors of Flow Sports?
They're 3 very different platforms which have 3 very different business models.
Okay, but YouTube, take that one. Competitor of Flow Sports?
Free content on YouTube could be a competitor. Again, it could be again, it depends how you're defining competitor, but the same audience, if there was similar content on YouTube, even if someone decided to give it away for free, then yes, it would be competitive.
How about Facebook?
It depends. Again, if somebody set up a Facebook channel and they were putting that stuff out there, even though it was free, it would still be competitive. It
Okay.
might not hurt their bottom line, but they would be competing for eyeballs and share of mind and everything else.
Right. So if a university decided to broadcast one of their events and put it on Facebook, that would be competitive in your mind, right?
Yes.
Okay. And I assume the same answer for Twitter?
Yes. If somebody was putting something on their Twitter feed that was in that vein, yes.
Would YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter be competitors to you if Flow Sports actually live streamed their content on those channels?
Would they be competitors? So you're asking me, would they be competitive with, if Flow Sport was live streaming content on Facebook, they would be competitive with, who are you asking me if they would be competitive with?
Would Facebook still be a competitor with Flow Sports if Flow Sports were live streaming their events on Facebook?
No.
What about Twitter?
No.
What about YouTube?
No, because they would, I'm going on the assumption that that is where Flow Sports has decided to live stream it, and that they understand that they're if anything, they're cannibalizing their own audience.
Okay. What about, you're familiar with Roku, Apple TV, those sites?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Both Roku and Apple TV allow you to stream media content from various online services, right?
Yes.
Okay. Not just Netflix and Amazon Prime, but also things like ESPN and even Flow Sports, right?
Yes.
Clearly, you can access competitive content on Roku and Apple TV, can't you?
Yes.
Okay. But Roku is not a competitor of Flow Sports, is it?
Well, it depends. There's the Roku channel, which Roku owns, where they broadcast content on and collect advertising dollars from. And if you were broadcasting similar content on the Roku channel, then it would be competitive. If you had an app on the Roku, just that lived on the Roku hardware, then no, in that instance, Roku would not be competitive.
Because why?
Because it is a piece of hardware on which the app sits.
Right. It is a platform on which the app sits, isn't it?
Yes, and and Roku does nothing to promote the apps on. In other words, Roku doesn't put out ads telling you to watch different content on their platform or anything else. They tell you to watch. They tell you to buy Roku, and they try to drive you to the Roku site. But the difference, which I think is what you're aiming at, is that here, and what affected my decision, was that Rockfin was actually advertising these events as being on Rockfin, and Roku does not advertise events as being on Roku.
Roku advertises Roku's product, doesn't it?
It advertises the hardware. Yes, it advertises the streaming stick. And
they also advertise the apps that are available on their streaming stick, don't they? In their ads, I'm not that familiar with theirs. I assume they will say you can get Netflix and Amazon and whatnot on a Roku streaming stick. Of course they would, because they want people to buy their hardware, don't they? Yes. Okay. Okay. Now, I believe that there was some language, I don't know if it came out in your testimony, but in your designation, that the differences between Rockfin and Flow Sports are superficial. Do you agree with that statement? More or less, yeah. I mean, it's fairly broad, but if I was looking at Rockfin if I was looking at both of those as a consumer, to the consumer, I think the differences are somewhat somewhat top level on it. It's how much, what the interfaces are different, and the payment methods are different. One is yearly, one is monthly. But when I get down to what's available, it's fairly, on the wrestling content, it's fairly similar. But Flow Sports, and correct me if you disagree, obtains the rights to broadcast the events on their platform, don't they?
Yes,
And Flow Sports decides what content to put on their channels for every single piece that is published, correct?
that's my understanding. Yes.
Right. And Rockfin is the opposite, isn't it? It does not decide at all what events or what content is going to be put on the site once the channel partner gets set up, correct?
That is what they say. Yes.
And you consider that to be a superficial distinction?
From a consumer, yes. For a consumer, yes, because at the end of the day, the content is not very different. In other words, what's on there doesn't appear to be very different. There's not like it's not like they're making drastic choices. I'm still seeing very, very similar programming. So again, whatever decisions are being made or not being made don't seem to result in a very dramatically different product.
Doesn't that whole superficial distinction also apply to Roku and Apple TV from the consumer perspective? In other words, that the consumer doesn't really care whether it's Roku or Apple TV or an app when they choose certain content? Doesn't that superficial distinction apply to those types of platforms as well?
I don't understand your question. I either own a Roku or I own an Apple TV. So are you asking me which one I would buy? I don't understand what you're asking me.
It seems to me, Mr. Wolf, you're saying that there's no real distinction from a consumer's point of view because they go onto Rockfin's platform and they see if they can find any wrestling content, and they go on Flow Sports channel and they see if they can find any wrestling content. That's your testimony, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm asking you if there's any principal difference between someone who goes on Roku and tries to find wrestling content. Why is that not the same thing to a company that you've admitted is not a competitor?
Because Roku is a piece of hardware, and they would have to find an app that showed wrestling content on it. So Roku is a piece of hardware, right?
Well, it's a piece of hardware, but from the consumer's perspective, it's a means to access content, isn't it?
I would disagree. No, it's a way. So the difference is you're trying to make a distinction that I don't think is valid. So Rockfin is a platform that lives on my internet browser, right? And that's very different than a piece of hardware that has a bunch of apps on it.
Okay, so, but as a consumer, they're using the internet to access both things, Roku and Rockfin, right?
Yes.
You can't get Roku without the internet, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, now, from the perspective of competitors, how do you reconcile, well, I should just confirm, Rockfin has nothing to put on Flow Sports. Like, remember how I was asking that Flow Sports could theoretically put its content on Rockfin? Do you remember that?
Yes.
It doesn't work in reverse. Rockfin doesn't publish anything. So Rockfin wouldn't have anything that it could put on as Rockfin as the entity to put on Flow Sports, does it?
It does not seem that way, no.
Okay, and how do you reconcile that Flow Sports can put content on Rockfin, but Rockfin has nothing to put on Flow Sports as to the fact that they're competitors? How do you reconcile that?
Well, you're asking me about a hypothetical situation that would likely never happen. So I'm not really clear on right? I mean,
I'm just asking you, how can you say that they're so similar if they're so different in that regard?
Because that's not something that makes them dramatically different. It's just it's a fairly technical thing that you've come up with for a legal argument in a court case that a consumer would never think about.
Okay, how do you reconcile your opinion with the fact that when Flow Sports was trying to get money in funding and investments in the past, they've defined their competitors as anyone who competes for live events? How do you reconcile that with your opinion here?
Objection, that mischaracterizes the evidence.
Overall, you can answer that question.
Okay, can you repeat that? That you said just so I'm answering you correctly.
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously testified that you believe that Flow Sports and Rockfin are competitors. How do you reconcile that opinion with testimony that we've heard in this trial that the CEO and CFO of Flow Sports, when seeking money from investors, defined their competitors as anyone who competes for live events?
Same objection, mischaracterizes evidence.
Overall,
I think that but there are places where they don't overlap, but in terms of wrestling content, they certainly do overlap. There's going to be, they're not one-to-one competitors. Rockfin has a lot of political content on there that doesn't compete in the slightest with Flow Sports. So there's, but there are places where they, in this instance, in terms of sports content, especially wrestling sports content, they do overlap.
So I want to ask you go back to, remember I asked you about Patreon, right?
Yes.
Patreon is a platform for content creators to monetize their content, much like Rockfin. Would you agree with that?
Not really, but yeah, but I mean, if you're saying it's a way for people to monetize content, yes.
Okay. And you're aware that wrestling content is on Patreon, are you not?
Yes.
Okay. And some of Flow Sports content writers about wrestling have now gone to Patreon. Do you believe that if someone who writes and ranks about wrestling on Flow Sports then does the same thing on Patreon, that therefore then that person is competing against Flow Sports on Patreon?
It would depend. Is that person competing against them? Yes. That
Okay.
their particular channel would seem to be competing against them if they
Okay.
if they were aiming for the same audience and they were charging money for it. Yes.
Okay. And Patreon has much more wrestling content on its site than Rockfin. You'd agree with that, right?
I haven't counted it, but yeah, it seems that way.
And you're familiar with Patreon, so you know that you can live stream events on Patreon, right?
Yes.
Okay. So Patreon is a competitor of of Flow Sports as well, right?
In that sense, yeah. In terms of that, yes.
Well, how is it any different than Rockfin?
Patreon is not putting out ads promoting the stuff. Patreon doesn't seem to put it under its belt. But yeah, it would in a lot of ways it would be a competitor if they're promoting if they're putting out the same type of programming, then yes, they are competing.
Are you testifying that Patreon does not promote its content creators?
To my knowledge, they do not put out specially targeted ads saying watch this on Patreon.
Okay, so if they are advertising their content creators, what are they not doing?
I don't understand the question.
If Patreon does in fact promote its content creators, would you agree that they would be just as much of a competitor as Rockfin?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know who Wrestling Nomad is?
No, I do not.
Okay. If he were a former Flow Sports person who wrote under the moniker Wrestling Nomad about wrestling and ranking, and then went on Patreon and did the same thing, would it change your opinion about whether they're competitors that Flow Sports actually tweeted a promotion of of Wrestling Nomad on Patreon?
I would need to know more about it. Clearly, there was a reason that they, I would want to know why they did that. If they thought there was some value to them. Clearly, they thought there was some value to them in doing it. So I'd want to understand why before I offered an opinion.
Well, isn't it possible that Flow Sports, being a broadcaster of wrestling events, would view people like Wrestling Nomad as actually good for business because it generates more interest in the live events that Flow Sports broadcasts?
It certainly, yeah, that sounds reasonable.
Are you familiar with sports information departments in professional and collegiate sports teams?
Oh, where they exist. I would not claim to be an expert beyond knowing they exist.
Right, and you understand why they exist, right? They provide information for media so that they will more easily be able to write about the sporting events that they're covering, correct?
Yes.
Great. So they exist because when a team receives media coverage, it can help create more interest in the sports watching public, which leads to more viewers and fans potentially, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and so isn't it true that Wrestling Nomad and also Mr. Sailor, when they write and rank about wrestling, actually generate more interest for subscribers to watch Flow Sports live streaming events?
Right. Well, that's what we were talking about before, with things can be both complementary and competitive. So the fact that Hulu exists and all these other streaming services create more interest in streaming services in general, which benefits Netflix, but it doesn't mean that they don't compete with each other at some level. It's, you know, it's a lot of semantics in terms of what competitive means. And that's, you know, that's, I guess, what you all are trying to figure out here.
It seems like my notes of your testimony was that you were saying that Flow Sports and Rockfin are both in the online video industry. Is that the industry that you would characterize both companies are in?
They have a lot more than that. They both have community. They both they're both. I've been following Flow Sports for a while, and they're both hard. It's hard to put a title to what they have. Everything is so new. But the one thing that makes both of them unique is that they have a sense of community. People have the ability to comment. They have message board. They have other things going on. So there's more. There's articles. There's more than just video. They're not just an ESPN.
Okay, but you would agree with me that there are thousands of those types of online communities where people, I mean, if you're not even limiting it to a particular kind of content, where people are online and creating a community, right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Yeah, okay. So it's clearly not the fact that they're both in the online video industry that makes them, in your view, competitors, right?
That's correct.
Right. And you testified about the sports video industry, did you not?
I guess, yeah.
What is the sports video industry to you?
Is exactly what it sounds. Is anything that is video. It can be pre-recorded video with commentary around sports. It can be live sporting events. It can be interviews with athletes. It can be fan-created video.
Okay, but it's not just articles, is it?
No, it would not have the term video in it if it was just articles.
Now, has anyone at Flow Sports ever told you that it was, and this is a phrase that I'm going to ask you to just, if you ever heard before, has anyone at Flow Sports ever told you it was recorded images of physical games or competition?
I don't remember hearing that term.
Okay. Do you like that definition?
Recorded images of physical games for competition. It's kind of funny. Yeah, I mean, you know,
a picture is a recorded image, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so would you agree that sports video industry includes just pictures?
No.
Okay, so that's not a good definition then, is it?
Of sports video, no. I haven't, you know, it's incredibly awkwardly worded. So no, it's not a good, I'm not happy with it.
Right, because
I wouldn't publish it in we wouldn't use it in.
Right, and the reason you wouldn't use it is because it includes pictures and still images, correct?
It would seem to imply that you're talking about that rather than moving. I mean, I would say moving images if I really wanted to get, but like this is getting really into the weeds.
Well, okay, and I appreciate that, but if it's moving images of physical games or competition, would that capture what you would view as sports video industry? That would include filming a nephew playing t-ball, wouldn't it?
It wouldn't be it wouldn't be my preferred definition, but you know, and I'd have to think about it some, but it doesn't sound completely off. I'm sure if you gave me 5 minutes, I could probably come up with a whole bunch of exceptions to what that, you know, to it.
Would you ever define sports video industry as anything that Flow Sports does?
Probably not.
Okay. Now you said that they're both companies are targeting NCAA wrestlers. I just wanted to make sure that the basis of that opinion is looking at the websites. You did not ask to review Flow Sports's records of marketing and promotion to try to access that unique demographic, did you?
No, I did not.
It's just from your looking at the websites?
I mean, they showed me some of the Facebook audiences that they, that they're targeting, but it was pretty clear from the websites,
Right. But you didn't look at all the Facebook targeted audiences. You just looked at the ones that Flow Sports wanted you to see, right?
I looked at what they, I would have no way otherwise to look at them. That's proprietary information.
Right.
If they didn't show it to me, I wouldn't be able to see it. Let's make, right. So, I mean,
And you haven't done any type of analysis of subscribers that have canceled one service and gone to the other or vice versa, have you, to determine competition?
no, I have not.
Okay. And would you expect that the subscribers to both platforms might be complementary, might like to have both of them?
I would suspect that would be the case, that there would be some people who would have both and some who would have one or the other. That's generally the nature of any competitive thing. The same way there are some, to Judge's earlier comment, there are some people who keep both Coke and Pepsi in the house, and some people who only keep Coke, and some people who only keep Pepsi.
How many hours total have you spent on this engagement, Mr. Wolk?
I have not added it up. I'd say probably somewhere between 10 to 15 hours.
And what are you being paid for your testimony?
Am I $500 an hour?
Okay. Past witness.
Mr. Wolk, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I wanted to ask you some things about your credentials. And looking at Flow 126, the only university that I've seen that you were affiliated with as being a professor was Rutgers back in 2010, 2011. Is that right?
That was it. Yes, that was an actual, where I taught an actual class over the course of a semester.
And what was that class in 2010, 2011?
God, I don't even remember. It was on digital media and social media back then, and the sort of burgeoning social video.
Okay. But so other than that class 9 or 10 years ago, you haven't taught any class at a university since then?
That's incorrect. I've done numerous guest lectures where I'm brought in to just sort of teach one, a single class.
Right, but I saw, for instance, that there's some reference to the USC Marshall School of Business. I went online, and you're not listed as a faculty member.
No, I'm not a faculty member there.
And you've never taught a course there. You've been asked to speak, like on one occasion or something like that.
Yes, that's
Okay.
that is exactly what Ms. Burgess said. Yes.
Okay, and there's no certifying. Not only do you not have a degree in competition analysis, but there's no kind of certifying entity like a licensing board or anything like that. Correct?
No.
Am I correct?
Yes, you are correct.
Okay. And you've never testified in a federal or state court who has qualified you as an expert in competition, true?
That is correct.
Do you hold yourself out as an expert in antitrust or predatory competition?
I do not.
And in this case, you prepared no report, is that right?
That is correct.
Your analysis is what we would call subjective, not objective, right?
Yes.
The approach you used was to look at certain things and give us your impression or opinion about them. Is that a fair assessment?
That is.
Who is David Zaslav?
David Zaslav. He is the CEO of Discovery Networks.
Okay. And is in fact, is his name appear, is he a friend of yours, first of all?
Yes, we've known each other since we were 19.
Okay. And he is one of the people who wrote a review, for lack of a better way to put it, of your book on the cover of your book. Is that right?
A blurb, yes.
I'm
Blurb.
sorry?
Blurb is the industry term. But yes, he did.
So he's one of the blurbs
Sorry,
promoted.
I'm sorry. Could you spell the word that you all are saying? I'm not sure I'm following.
BLURB.
Blurb. Okay.
Right.
Thank
And
you.
and Mr. Zaslav, is he also an investor in Flow Sports?
I have no idea.
Were you involved in some of the fundraising where Mr. Zaslav was interested in being an investor in Flow Sports?
No,
Have you met Paul Hurdlow before this case?
I have not.
And your book is on the subject of television, is that right?
Yes,
And how television was being overcome by the internet, not by anything really directly relevant to this case, correct?
it's about how television and online video are sort of becoming one and the same. So,
And are you a subscriber to Rockfin?
yes,
As of when?
as of this week.
Do you consider yourself a member of the college wrestling community or audience?
No,
How about the high school wrestling community?
no,
So you don't, whatever their perception may be, you're not coming at that from any personal experience because you're not even a member of that community, right?
that is correct.
And did I hear you correctly to say that more options for consumers is a good thing?
Yes. For consumers, yes.
And what you're saying in this case really is basically, if people can see something on both systems, then you believe that's competitive. Is that a summary of your testimony?
No, it's not.
I'll pass the witness.
I just have one question, Judge. And famous last words, right? But have you seen, Mr. Walk, whether Flow Sports is registered with the DMCA?
Yes, I have. You had showed that to me, and they are.
And does it impact the analysis of competition?
It means that they both have community sites on them. Companies will generally take out a DMCA certification when they want to protect themselves from somebody making comments on their site, or sort of, having any sort of user created content on the site, whether it's a comment, whether it's a video, anything like that. So
There's
it
some
would
foundation.
not be the basis of saying,
Excuse me, sir, I think you've answered her question. She's gonna ask you another one, I imagine, even though she said one. I knew that wasn't really right, so it's okay. She has another one. She can ask it now.
Okay. I'm going to pass the witness.
Anything else, Mr. Rudica?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Sotero?
Very briefly, Mr. Wilk, what entity or person are you aware of that posts anything on Flow Sports that isn't run through Flow Sports and Flow Sports controls?
I'm not aware of anybody who does it. I'm not aware of what the posting system on Flow Sports at the back end looks like. So,
No further questions.
Anything else? Ms. Perkins?
Oh, no, Your Honor.
Okay, I have a question for you. It really is a hypothetical. If my son
yes.
goes to a school with a very top-rated high school wrestling program, most of his classmates that wrestle are top recruits for colleges.
Right.
It's known as the high school for, superstar wrestler types.
Yes.
When they win their NCAA tournaments or their UIL or whatever they call them in high school, and they're on their way to colleges, and it's a known hotspot, the good use of that term, hotspot, for wrestling, right?
Yeah.
And so these are my son's classmates. My son writes for the school newspaper, and my son has developed a reputation as the best high school newspaper reporter around, and he writes very entertaining, very popular, really cool articles about wrestling. Is my son publishing his articles in the high school newspaper that many people watch and follow, a competitor of Flow Sports?
It would depend on whether they viewed him as a really good high school reporter or they viewed him as being at the same level as a professional reporter. Right.
Whose opinion is it that you're asking?
If the audience,
Hang on. Whose opinion does it depend on? What Flow Sports thinks about how good my son is, or what somebody else thinks about how good my son is? Whose opinion does it depend on?
The latter. If people are saying, okay, I can either read the judge's son or I can read something on Flow Sports, and I have to choose between the two, or if they consider it to be just sort of a nice high school reporter. Again, it's so many shades of gray. It's really not a one-to-one. But if people are going to, again, and it's sort of how are you defining competition? Yes, they're writing about the same space, and is he charging for it? No. So you're not getting subscription dollars away, but are you getting eyeballs away from them? Possibly. It depends on whether they hold his writing in the same value as somebody who holds himself out to be a professional writer.
So are you telling me that the definition of whether or not these two companies are competitive is dependent on the customers who think so?
100%.
So Mr. Sanderson might, for example, hypothetically think so, but another customer of these two don't think so. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
What do I do with that information? One customer thinks they are competitors. One customer thinks they're not competitors. It's not objective. What makes them, why should I believe you that it's a competitor?
It would seem that because the content seems, again, if you look at the world of the content that's on there, they seem to be, they're targeting this, it's very similar. It seems to be attracting the same viewers. You would need to do analysis of how many people are sort of subscribing to both, or how many went from one to the other. And
so, wait a minute now. So are you suggesting that we poll consumers and say, how many of you think that these guys are competitive and how many of you don't think that they're competitive? And on the basis of the results of that poll, I'm to decide this multi-$1,000, hundreds of $1,000s in attorney's fees alone lawsuit? Really?
that's why I'm not a judge.
You see where I'm headed with that?
I do. I think you sort of have to look at the broader category, and I think in this case you don't need to poll people. I think you can look at what's on both sites and determine that it's quite similar, and that it's written by people with the same, it's sort of produced by people with the same level of experience and expertise. So if you would ask me, in the previous example, if there was another high school newspaper where somebody was, that also had somebody that was also, their rival, and is their school newspaper and somebody writing good columns for that competitive? Yes. But in this case, you seem to have people at about the same level of experience, the same sort of same audience, and the same level of knowledge, writing about a similar topic and producing content around a similar topic. So it would seem to be competitive. If I was looking for this.
But hang on. In my hypothetical, if my son sold a story to the Austin American-Statesman on a regular basis about that, would my son then be a competitor of Flow Sports?
Yeah.
So it doesn't just, in your mind, it has a lot to do with whether somebody's getting paid, or does it have a lot to do with the circulation of the medium? I'm just trying to understand. I mean,
yeah, and the stature of it too. In other words, the Austin newspaper has some weight. It's they're known to publish. We'll assume that the Austin newspaper is known to publish high quality wrestling content. So in that case,
assuming a fact not in evidence, but aside from that, you can continue.
So if that was the case, then yes, they would be competing with Flow Sports, which was also assumed to be.
Okay. Well, I hear what you're saying, but I hope you can appreciate why this is a complicated and difficult.
100%.
Okay, because I mean, the subjectivity of it is one thing, but the subjective opinion of a consumer, not before the court, whose opinion we don't know, seems to be, in some respects at least, the linchpin on whether or not this competition really exists. And I'm puzzled by how that might be the measure we use to determine the outcome of the issue. And that's troubling. But I don't have any other questions for Mr. Walk, so you, sir, may be excused. And with that, I must absolutely give the court reporter a break for at least 15 minutes. We'll be in recess until then. When we come back, we'll start with the next witness. Thank you, sir. Stay safe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Judge, and thank all of you out there in Texas. Stay safe.
We'll be in recess for 15 minutes.